In the ancient world, around 550 years before the Common Era, a young prince named Cyrus stood at a crossroads. His grandfather, Astyages, ruled the Median Empire with an iron grip. But Cyrus had a vision that reached far beyond the borders of his grandfather's kingdom. What happened next would change the course of history and create an empire unlike any the world had yet seen. The rebellion against Astyages was not just a family dispute. It was the birth of something new. When Cyrus emerged victorious around 550 BCE, he didn't simply claim his grandfather's throne. Instead, he founded an entirely new capital at Pasargadae, built on the very site where his triumph had been secured. This was a statement, a declaration that the old order had passed and something different was beginning. From this modest beginning, Cyrus would go on to conquer three of the most powerful kingdoms of his time. First came the Median Empire itself, already under his control. Then he turned his attention westward to Lydia, the wealthy kingdom ruled by the legendary King Croesus, a man whose name had become synonymous with riches. And finally, the great Neo-Babylonian Empire fell before him. In the span of just a few decades, Cyrus had assembled the largest empire the world had ever known, stretching from the shores of the Aegean Sea and the lands of Anatolia, all the way east to the distant Indus Valley. But what made Cyrus truly remarkable wasn't just the size of his conquests. It was how he chose to rule. Many conquerors throughout history have seized territory through violence and held it through fear. Cyrus understood something more subtle, something that would echo through the centuries. He divided his vast empire into provinces called satrapies, each overseen by a governor known as a satrap. These weren't just military outposts. They were administrative centers connected by an elaborate system of royal roads and an early postal network that allowed messages to travel across thousands of kilometers with remarkable speed. Imagine the achievement of this. In an age before modern technology, before telecommunications, before even the printing press, Cyrus created a system that could relay information from one end of his empire to the other. A rider could set off from Pasargadae with a message and, through a series of relay stations, that message could reach the distant borders where the empire touched the Indus River, or the western shores where it met the Aegean. But the infrastructure was only part of the story. What truly set Cyrus apart was his approach to the peoples he conquered. When most rulers of his time would have imposed their own gods, their own customs, their own language upon defeated populations, Cyrus did something different. He allowed the conquered peoples to keep their own traditions, their own religions, their own local leaders. This wasn't weakness. It was wisdom. The most famous example of this tolerance is recorded on what has come to be known as the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay artifact that some scholars call the first charter of human rights. On this cylinder, Cyrus proclaimed principles that were revolutionary for his time: religious tolerance and the right of displaced peoples to return to their homelands. Among those who benefited from this policy were the Jewish people who had been exiled in Babylon. Cyrus allowed them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, a decision that would be remembered and honored for millennia. This policy of tolerance wasn't just idealistic, it was practical. By allowing local customs and religions to continue, by working with existing power structures rather than destroying them, Cyrus created an empire that was more stable, more peaceful, and ultimately more enduring than it would have been if held together purely by force. People who were allowed to keep their identity, their traditions, their dignity, were far less likely to rebel than those who had everything stripped away. The ancient sources tell us that Cyrus gained a reputation for mercy that was unusual for conquerors of his era. He was called Father of his People, a title that spoke to something more than just fear or respect. It suggested genuine affection, a sense that this emperor, despite his power, despite commanding an empire that spanned a continent, had earned the loyalty of his subjects not just through military might, but through fairness and wisdom. And yet, for all his power, for all the vast territories he controlled, Cyrus chose a remarkably humble final resting place. His tomb at Pasargadae still stands today, more than 2,000 years after his death. It's a simple structure of limestone, modest and understated. There are no towering monuments, no elaborate decorations, no mountains of gold. Just a quiet tomb for a man who had commanded an empire stretching from sea to sea. This simplicity tells us something about Cyrus. Here was a man who could have built anything, who had the resources of 3 conquered kingdoms at his disposal, who could have commissioned a tomb that would dwarf the pyramids. Instead, he chose something simple, something that spoke to restraint rather than excess. The tomb stands as a reminder that Cyrus the Great understood something fundamental about power. True greatness isn't measured in the size of monuments or the weight of treasure accumulated. It's measured in the lives improved, in the systems created that outlast their creator, in the precedents set for those who come after. When Cyrus died around 530 BCE, he left behind more than just an empire. He left behind an idea that conquest could be tempered with mercy, that power could be exercised with wisdom, that different peoples with different customs and beliefs could coexist under a single banner without losing what made them unique. This was revolutionary. The Cyrus Cylinder's principles of tolerance and the right of return would echo through history, influencing ideas about governance and human rights for centuries to come. Later rulers would look back to Cyrus as a model, an example of how an empire could be both powerful and humane, both vast and stable. In the quiet of Pasargadae, in the simple tomb that holds his remains, Cyrus the Great rests. But his legacy stretches far beyond that limestone structure. He showed the world that an empire could be built not just with swords and soldiers, but with tolerance, with respect for local customs, with the wisdom to know that ruling people is different from simply conquering them. And so we remember Cyrus, not just as a conqueror who built the largest empire the world had yet seen, but as a ruler who understood that true power comes from winning hearts as well as battles, from building systems that endure rather than monuments that crumble, from setting precedents that would influence the course of human civilization for thousands of years to come. In the year 51 before the Common Era, a young woman ascended to the throne of Egypt. She was barely more than a teenager, thrust into a world of palace intrigue, sibling rivalry, and the looming shadow of Rome, the greatest military power the world had ever known. Her name was Cleopatra, the 7th to bear that name in the Ptolemaic dynasty. History would remember her in ways both accurate and distorted, but the truth of her story is far more fascinating than the myths. The Ptolemaic kingdom that Cleopatra inherited was already ancient by the standards of her time. Her family had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals who had claimed the land of the pharaohs after Alexander's empire fractured. But by Cleopatra's time, this once mighty kingdom had become something of a shadow, squeezed between its glorious past and an uncertain future, with Rome growing ever more powerful to the north. What set Cleopatra apart from her predecessors was something remarkable, something that might seem small but was actually profound. She learned to speak Egyptian. This might not sound extraordinary until you realize that she was the only Ptolemaic ruler known to have done so. For 300 years, her family had ruled Egypt while speaking Greek, keeping themselves apart from the people they governed, maintaining the language and customs of their Macedonian heritage. Cleopatra broke this pattern. She didn't just learn Egyptian, she learned several languages, immersing herself in the role of pharaoh in a way her ancestors never had. But languages were just the beginning. Ancient sources tell us that Cleopatra was educated in rhetoric, philosophy, and science. They describe her voice as persuasive, her conversation as captivating. One ancient writer suggested that her power came not from her physical appearance, which he implied was pleasant but not extraordinary, but from her intellect, her wit, and her ability to engage anyone in discussion. This was a woman whose greatest weapon was her mind. Yet even a brilliant mind couldn't protect her from the realities of palace politics. As a young co-ruler, Cleopatra found herself locked in conflict with her brother husband, Ptolemy XIII, a boy king controlled by ambitious advisors who saw the intelligent young queen as a threat. In a dramatic turn of events, Cleopatra was driven into exile, forced to flee from her own kingdom. For many rulers, this would have been the end of the story. For Cleopatra, it was just the beginning. She returned in a way that would become legendary. With the support of Julius Caesar, the Roman general who had arrived in Egypt pursuing his rival Pompey, Cleopatra reclaimed her throne. The details of their first meeting have been embellished over the centuries, but what matters is what came after. She had recognized something crucial. Egypt's survival depended on Rome, and Rome's generals needed what Egypt could provide. What Egypt had was grain. Vast quantities of grain, grown in the fertile Nile Delta and stored in warehouses that could feed armies and cities. Egypt also had wealth, accumulated over millennia. These were Cleopatra's leverage in the brutal game of Roman politics. She positioned herself not as a conquered queen begging for mercy, but as an indispensable ally, a partner who could offer resources that Rome desperately needed. With Caesar, she formed both a political alliance and a romantic relationship. She had a son by him, Caesarion, whom she claimed as Caesar's heir. She traveled to Rome, living there as Caesar's guest, witnessing firsthand the power and politics of the republic that was slowly transforming into an empire. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BCE, Cleopatra must have understood that Egypt's position had become even more precarious. After the chaos of Caesar's death, when Rome descended into civil war between various factions fighting for control, Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of the three men who emerged to divide the Roman world among themselves. Like her relationship with Caesar, this was both personal and political. Ancient sources tell us they genuinely cared for each other, but we must also recognize the strategic calculation beneath the romance. Antony controlled Rome's eastern territories and needed Egypt's resources. Cleopatra needed Roman military protection against those who would see Egypt absorbed into the growing Roman Empire. She presented herself to her Egyptian subjects as the goddess Isis incarnate, blending political power with religious authority in the ancient tradition of the pharaohs. This wasn't merely theater. It was a deliberate effort to connect herself to thousands of years of Egyptian tradition, to position herself as the legitimate continuation of a line stretching back to the very beginning of Egyptian civilization. But the world was changing in ways that even Cleopatra's brilliance couldn't fully control. In Rome, another power was rising. Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who would later become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. Octavian and Antony were on a collision course, and Egypt was caught in the middle. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. It was a naval battle off the coast of Greece, and it would determine the fate of the ancient world. Cleopatra commanded her own ships in the engagement, a fleet of Egyptian vessels that she personally led into battle. This detail is often overlooked, but it tells us something important. She was not merely a woman in a palace playing at politics. She was a naval commander, actively engaged in the military defense of her kingdom. The battle was a disaster. Antony and Cleopatra's forces were defeated, and they retreated to Egypt, knowing that Octavian would follow. The end, when it came, was inevitable. Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, facing capture and the prospect of being paraded through Rome in Octavian's triumph, chose death on her own terms. The famous story of the asp, the poisonous snake, may or may not be true, but what matters is that she denied Octavian the satisfaction of displaying her as a captive. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, Egypt became a Roman province. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted for 3,000 years, came to an end. The last chapter of ancient Egypt's independence closed, and the land of the pyramids became just another territory in Rome's expanding empire. History has not always been kind to Cleopatra. Later writers, particularly Roman historians working under emperors who traced their lineage to Octavian, portrayed her as a seductress who led Roman generals astray, a dangerous Eastern queen who used her feminine wiles to manipulate honorable men. This narrative has persisted, shaping how many people think of her even today. But this version of Cleopatra is a distortion, a story crafted by the victors to justify their conquest and diminish her achievements. The real Cleopatra was far more complex and far more impressive. She was a skilled diplomat navigating an impossible situation, a learned scholar who could debate philosophy with the great minds of her age, a military commander who led fleets into battle, and a ruler who tried everything in her power to preserve Egyptian independence against the most formidable military machine the world had yet seen. She spoke multiple languages in a world where most rulers couldn't be bothered to learn the tongue of their subjects. She understood that knowledge was power, that persuasion could achieve what force could not, that alliances needed to be built on genuine value offered to all parties. She recognized the importance of symbols and presentation, styling herself as Isis to connect with Egyptian religious tradition, while also engaging with Roman culture and power on its own terms. In the end, she faced an unwinnable situation. Rome was simply too powerful, too organized, too vast. No amount of intelligence or strategic thinking could overcome the fundamental imbalance of power between Egypt and Rome. But she fought anyway, using every tool at her disposal: diplomacy, alliance, military force, economic leverage, religious authority, personal relationships. Cleopatra's story is often told as a romance, a tale of a beautiful queen and her powerful lovers. But perhaps it's better understood as a tragedy of geopolitics, the story of a brilliant leader trying to preserve her nation's independence against inevitable historical forces. She lost that battle, but she fought it with intelligence, courage, and determination. In the quiet moments, we might imagine her in the palace at Alexandria, surrounded by scrolls and scholars, speaking in Egyptian to her subjects and in Greek to her court, writing letters in multiple languages to allies and rivals across the Mediterranean world. A woman with the weight of 3,000 years of history on her shoulders, trying to write one more chapter in the story of Egypt's greatness, even as the shadows of Rome grew longer across her kingdom. She was the last pharaoh, the final chapter in one of humanity's longest-running stories. And though she couldn't prevent the ending that was coming, she ensured that the story would be remembered, that people would still speak her name more than 2,000 years after her death. In that sense, perhaps Cleopatra achieved a kind of immortality that even the greatest empires cannot claim. There are few stories in history as dramatic as that of transformation, of a person fundamentally changing who they are and what they believe. In ancient India, in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a prince became an emperor, and that emperor became something else entirely. His name was Ashoka, and his story is one of the most remarkable journeys from darkness to light that history has recorded. Ashoka was born into the Mauryan dynasty, the 3rd emperor of a line that had united much of the Indian subcontinent. The empire he inherited around 268 BCE was already vast, stretching from present-day Afghanistan and parts of Persia in the west, through the heartland of India, reaching Bengal in the east and pushing deep into the southern reaches of the subcontinent. It was an empire of incredible diversity, encompassing countless languages, cultures, and traditions. The young Ashoka who came to power was, by many accounts, a harsh ruler. Some traditions gave him nicknames that emphasized his cruelty as a prince, suggesting a man who governed through fear and violence, who saw power as something to be seized and held through force. This was not unusual for the time. Many rulers believed that strength and severity were necessary to maintain control over vast territories filled with different peoples who might, at any moment, choose to rebel. For several years, Ashoka ruled in this manner, consolidating his power, suppressing dissent, expanding his territories. And then came Kalinga. The kingdom of Kalinga, located along the eastern coast of India, had remained independent, a prosperous region that had resisted incorporation into the Mauryan Empire. Around 261 BCE, Ashoka decided to bring Kalinga under his control. What followed was one of the bloodiest campaigns in ancient Indian history. The Kalinga War was brutal beyond measure. Ancient sources tell us that over 100,000 people died in the fighting. Countless others were deported from their homes, their lives uprooted by the violence of conquest. Cities were besieged, populations were displaced, and the land itself bore the scars of the conflict. And Ashoka won. Kalinga fell to his armies, and another territory was added to the Mauryan Empire. But something happened in the aftermath of this victory. Something changed in Ashoka himself. Looking at the devastation his armies had wrought, seeing the scale of suffering his ambition had caused, Ashoka experienced what can only be described as a profound moral crisis. The sources tell us he felt deep remorse, a crushing weight of guilt for the death and destruction his conquest had brought. This wasn't just regret over a military campaign that had been more costly than expected. This was a fundamental questioning of everything he had believed about power, about conquest, about what it meant to rule. In his anguish, Ashoka turned to Buddhism, a religion that had been growing in India for several centuries but had not yet achieved the prominence it would later gain. Buddhism's core teachings of non-violence, compassion, and the reduction of suffering spoke to something in Ashoka's transformed heart. He converted, not as a political move or a superficial gesture, but as a complete reorientation of his life and his reign. And then he did something extraordinary. He began to govern according to these principles. Across his empire, Ashoka ordered the erection of pillars and the carving of edicts into rock faces. These weren't monuments to his military glory or lists of conquered territories. They were messages to his people, written in local languages so that they could be understood by ordinary subjects, not just the elite. These edicts proclaimed what Ashoka called Dhamma, a concept of ethical conduct that emphasized moral behavior, compassion, and righteous living. The edicts speak of non-violence, of treating all people with respect and dignity. They call for religious tolerance, acknowledging that people follow different paths and believe different things, and that this diversity should be protected rather than suppressed. They express concern for animal welfare, showing compassion that extended beyond just human beings. They mandate fair justice, calling on officials to treat subjects with kindness and to resolve disputes with wisdom rather than arbitrary force. But Ashoka didn't just issue proclamations. He backed them up with action. He ordered the construction of roads throughout his empire, and along those roads, he commanded that wells be dug so that travelers would have access to water. He had trees planted to provide shade for those journeying from one place to another. He established rest houses where people could stop and recover from their travels. These might seem like small things, but they represented a fundamental shift in how Ashoka understood the purpose of government. He was framing infrastructure not as tools of control, not as ways to move armies more efficiently or extract taxes more effectively, but as expressions of care for the well-being of his subjects. The wells, the shade trees, the rest houses, these were manifestations of Dhamma, practical demonstrations that the empire existed to serve the people, not the other way around. Ashoka also supported the spread of Buddhism beyond India's borders. He sent missions to Sri Lanka and other regions, helping to transform what had been a relatively localized religion into one with a global reach. These weren't military expeditions. They were peaceful missions of monks and scholars, carrying ideas rather than swords, offering wisdom rather than demanding submission. The rock and pillar edicts that Ashoka left behind are remarkable for another reason. They give us one of the earliest direct voices of an Indian ruler. Many ancient kings are known to us only through the accounts of others, through the writings of historians and chroniclers who may have had their own agendas. But Ashoka speaks to us directly, across more than 2 millennia, in his own words carved into stone. And what he tells us is that he had changed, that the slaughter at Kalinga had transformed him, and that he wanted his subjects to know that their emperor now ruled by different principles. Imagine the bureaucrats and governors receiving these new orders from their emperor. After years of harsh rule, of governing through fear and military might, suddenly their ruler was telling them to show compassion, to be fair, to consider the welfare of even the animals. Some must have been confused. Others might have been skeptical, wondering if this was just another political strategy. But Ashoka persisted, using every tool of imperial communication to spread his message of ethical governance. The transformation wasn't perfect. Ashoka remained an emperor, and empires are inherently structures of power and control. Some of his edicts mention punishments for those who refused to follow Dhamma, suggesting that his conversion to non-violence had limits. But even acknowledging these complexities, what Ashoka attempted was remarkable: to govern a vast, diverse empire according to principles of compassion and moral conduct, to use the apparatus of state power not just to conquer and control, but to improve the lives of ordinary people. The contrast between the early Ashoka and the later Ashoka is stark. The cruel prince became the compassionate emperor. The conqueror who waded through blood at Kalinga became the ruler who built wells and rest houses, who preached tolerance and non-violence, who tried to reduce suffering rather than inflict it. This before and after arc, this journey from darkness to light, is what makes Ashoka's story so compelling. He reminds us that people can change, that even those who have committed terrible acts can experience genuine transformation and spend the rest of their lives trying to make amends. His story suggests that remorse can be a powerful force, that confronting the consequences of our actions can lead to fundamental changes in who we are and how we live. For nearly 40 years after the Kalinga War, Ashoka ruled according to his transformed principles. When he died around 232 BCE, he left behind an empire that had been shaped by his conversion. The Buddhist missions he sponsored would carry that religion across Asia, eventually making it one of the world's major faiths. The principles of Dhamma he carved into rock would influence Indian thought for centuries. But perhaps his most important legacy is simply the story itself. The story of a brutal conqueror who looked at what he had done and said, "No more." The story of a powerful emperor who realized that true strength lies not in the ability to inflict violence, but in the wisdom to choose compassion instead. The story of transformation, of the possibility that we can become better than we were, that the past does not have to determine the future. In the quiet of night, we might imagine Ashoka in his later years, perhaps visiting one of the pillars where his edicts were carved, running his hand over the stone and the words inscribed there. Words about kindness, about justice, about treating all beings with respect. An old emperor, nearing the end of his life, knowing that he had tried, in the years that remained to him after Kalinga, to be better, to rule differently, to use power for something other than just accumulating more power. The wells he ordered dug have long since run dry. The trees he planted have fallen and decayed. The rest houses have crumbled. But the words remain, carved in stone, speaking across the centuries. A reminder that change is possible, that remorse can lead to redemption, and that even the most powerful rulers must ultimately choose what kind of legacy they wish to leave behind. Picture a cold military camp on the frontier of the Roman Empire. It's late at night, and in a simple tent, a man sits writing by lamplight. Outside, soldiers keep watch against barbarian raids. The wind carries the chill of the Danube River. Inside, the man writes not dispatches or battle plans, but philosophical reflections on life, duty, and mortality. This man is Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, and the words he writes in this moment will echo across nearly 2,000 years. Marcus Aurelius became emperor in the year 161 of the Common Era, ascending to lead what was still the greatest power in the Western world. The Roman Empire at this time stretched from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to the borders of Persia. It was a vast machinery of government, military might, and economic power. And Marcus Aurelius, trained since childhood to one day hold this position, found himself at its center. But he didn't rule alone, at least not at first. He shared power with Lucius Verus, a co-emperor, breaking with the recent tradition of sole rule. This arrangement reflected Marcus's philosophical training in Stoicism, a school of thought that emphasized reason, duty, and the recognition that no single person has all the answers. Later, he would share power with his son Commodus, though this decision would have consequences he likely never anticipated. Marcus had been raised on Stoic philosophy, studying under some of the finest teachers Rome could provide. Stoicism taught that virtue was the highest good, that external circumstances beyond our control should not disturb our inner peace, and that we should focus our energy on what we can actually change rather than lamenting what we cannot. It was a philosophy well suited to a ruler who would face constant challenges, wars, and crises. And crises came in abundance. Marcus Aurelius spent much of his reign not in the comfortable palaces of Rome, but on the frontiers of the empire, dealing with wars that would later be called the Marcomannic conflicts. Germanic tribes were pushing against Rome's northern borders, threatening provinces that had known peace for generations. The emperor had to be there, commanding armies, making strategic decisions, enduring the hardships of military campaign alongside his soldiers. But that wasn't the only challenge. During his reign, a devastating plague swept through the empire, later called the Antonine Plague. This disease killed vast numbers of people, soldiers and civilians alike, weakening the empire's military strength and economic stability at precisely the moment when Rome faced serious threats on its borders. Marcus watched his armies depleted by disease, saw cities ravaged by illness, and struggled to keep the empire functioning while death moved invisibly through his domains. It was during these campaigns, in these cold and difficult years on the frontier, that Marcus wrote what would become known as Meditations. The original manuscript sometimes titled it simply To Himself, because these were never meant to be published. They were private notes, personal reflections that Marcus wrote to remind himself of his philosophical principles, to work through his thoughts, to steel himself for the duties he faced. Imagine the weight he carried. He was responsible for millions of lives, for the defense of an empire that had existed for centuries, for maintaining the systems that brought food to cities, justice to provinces, and order to a complex web of territories and peoples. He could not afford to collapse under the pressure, to give in to despair or frustration or the simple exhaustion of command. So he wrote to himself, reminding himself of what mattered. He wrote about the transitory nature of fame and power, noting that emperors who had seemed all-powerful in their time were now forgotten, their achievements turned to dust. He wrote about accepting what we cannot change, focusing instead on our own actions and choices. He wrote about duty, about doing what needs to be done even when it's difficult, even when we're tired, even when we'd rather be somewhere else. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this and you will find strength. These weren't abstract philosophical exercises. They were tools for survival, ways for a weary emperor to maintain his composure and his sense of purpose in circumstances that might have broken a lesser person. In the pages of Meditations, we can almost hear the exhaustion, the stress, the burden of responsibility. But we also hear something else, a determination to remain true to his principles, to be a good man and a good ruler regardless of the circumstances. Marcus wrote about simplicity, reminding himself that despite all the imperial luxury available to him, what he really needed was very basic. Food, shelter, a clear conscience, the ability to do his duty. He wrote about mortality, about how brief life is and how foolish it is to waste time on things that don't truly matter. He wrote about the interconnectedness of all things, how each person is part of a larger whole, and how we should act for the common good rather than just our own narrow interests. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be, he wrote. Be one. There's something poignant about an emperor writing these things to himself. Here was a man with nearly absolute power, at least in theory, and yet he was using that power to tell himself to stay humble, to remember that he was mortal, to focus on being virtuous rather than chasing pleasure or glory. In a position where many would have given in to excess, to the temptations of unchecked authority, Marcus tried to live simply and think clearly. His Stoic training taught him that external goods, wealth, fame, power, physical pleasure, were neither inherently good nor bad. They were indifferents, things that could be used well or poorly but that shouldn't be the focus of a good life. What mattered was virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline. These were the things within his control, the things he could work on regardless of whether the wars went well or poorly, whether the plague continued or abated, whether the empire prospered or struggled. And yet, for all his wisdom, for all his philosophical training and personal virtue, Marcus Aurelius made a decision that historians still debate. Rather than choosing a capable adult successor, someone proven and competent to take on the enormous responsibilities of ruling Rome, he left the empire to his son Commodus. This was not unusual. Many rulers have wanted to pass power to their children. But Commodus would prove to be a disaster as emperor, his reign marked by cruelty, excess, and instability that undermined much of what his father had worked to preserve. Did Marcus know? Could he see that his son lacked the temperament and wisdom for rule? Or did he hope that Commodus would grow into the role, that the young man would mature and develop the virtues that Marcus himself had cultivated? We don't know. What we do know is that this decision, made by a philosopher-emperor who wrote extensively about wisdom and judgment, would have consequences that echoed through Roman history. The irony is painful. Here was a man who wrote about accepting what we cannot control, about focusing on our own virtue and actions rather than external outcomes. And yet the external outcome of his own succession choice would help usher in a period of instability and decline. Even the wisest among us, it seems, have blind spots, make mistakes, fail to see clearly when our emotions and desires cloud our judgment. Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180, likely on campaign, still serving, still trying to hold the empire together against the pressures that threatened it from within and without. His last years were spent as his middle years had been. In military camps, dealing with threats, managing crises, doing his duty even when it was hard, even when he was tired, even when he might have wished for rest. The book he left behind, never intended for publication, would become one of the most influential philosophical texts in history. Generations of readers would find comfort and guidance in his words, would see in his struggles a reflection of their own, would be inspired by his attempt to live according to his principles even in the most difficult circumstances. Meditations reminds us that even those with great power face doubts and difficulties, that wisdom doesn't eliminate struggle but rather gives us tools to face struggle with dignity and purpose. It shows us an emperor who understood that the true test of character comes not in moments of triumph but in moments of hardship, not when things are easy but when they're hard. In the cold camps of the Danube, in the midst of war and plague and the crushing responsibilities of empire, Marcus Aurelius wrote words that still resonate. Words about accepting what we cannot change and changing what we can. Words about duty and virtue and the importance of maintaining our humanity even in inhuman circumstances. Words about being kind to others, about forgiving those who wrong us, about remembering that we're all struggling in our own ways. Be like the headland against which the waves continually break, he wrote, but it stands firm and tames the fury of the water around it. That headland, standing firm against the waves, that was Marcus's aspiration for himself. Not to be invulnerable, not to be unaffected by the difficulties of life, but to stand firm nonetheless, to maintain his principles, to do his duty, to remain a good man in a world that often rewarded the opposite. And in those quiet moments, riding by lamplight in a tent on the frontier, with the weight of an empire on his shoulders and the cold wind blowing outside, Marcus Aurelius tried to be that headland, tried to stand firm, tried to be the person his philosophy taught him to be, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. The words remain, the struggles continue, and across the centuries his voice speaks to us still, reminding us that wisdom and virtue are possible even in the darkest times, that duty is its own reward, and that the measure of a life is not found in power or pleasure, but in how we face the challenges that come to us all. On the vast steppes of Mongolia in the late 12th century, a boy named Temujin lived a life that seemed destined for obscurity or early death. His father had been poisoned by enemies. His family had been abandoned by their clan, left to starve on the harsh grasslands where survival meant constant struggle against hunger, cold, and hostile neighbors. This boy, left with almost nothing, would grow up to become Genghis Khan, the founder of the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The transformation from abandoned child to universal ruler is one of history's most dramatic stories. Temujin's early life was defined by hardship that would have broken most people. Without the protection of a tribe, his family survived on the edge of starvation, gathering roots and catching fish, existing in a world where other clans could attack them with impunity. The death of his father had robbed them not just of a provider, but of their place in the social structure of the Mongolian steppe. But Temujin proved to be resilient in ways that went beyond mere survival. He formed alliances, forging bonds of loyalty with other outcasts and ambitious men who saw in him something worth following. Slowly, carefully, he built power from almost nothing. He understood something fundamental about the steppe culture he'd been born into, that loyalty and competence mattered more than noble birth, that the harsh environment of Mongolia created men who valued results over pedigree. The Mongolian steppe at this time was divided among numerous tribes who spent as much time fighting each other as they did hunting and herding. There was no unity, no larger purpose beyond the immediate concerns of each clan. Temujin saw the waste in this, the way these constant small conflicts kept the Mongol people weak and divided. He began to bring tribes together, sometimes through alliance, sometimes through conquest, but always with a vision of something larger. By 1206, Temujin had accomplished something unprecedented. He had united the Mongol tribes into a single people, and they proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. This wasn't just a new title. It was the birth of a nation, the transformation of scattered tribes into an organized force that would soon reshape the world. What made the Mongol military so effective wasn't just the legendary horsemanship of steppe warriors or their skill with composite bows. It was organization. Genghis Khan implemented a decimal system, dividing his forces into units of tens, hundreds, and thousands. Each unit had clear lines of command and responsibility. This structure allowed for flexibility in tactics while maintaining discipline and coordination across vast distances. But perhaps even more revolutionary was how Genghis Khan chose his leaders. In a world where noble birth typically determined who commanded armies and held positions of authority, he promoted based on merit and loyalty. A herder could become a general if he proved himself capable. A former enemy could be welcomed into high positions if he demonstrated skill and commitment. This meant that the Mongol forces were led by the most competent people available, not just those who happened to be born into the right families. The empire that Genghis Khan built expanded with breathtaking speed. From the Mongolian heartland, his armies swept east into China, west into Central Asia and the Middle East, and north into the forests and plains of Russia and Eastern Europe. At its greatest extent, the Mongol Empire would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Europe, encompassing more territory than any previous empire in history. This expansion came at an enormous cost in human life. The Mongol conquests were marked by destruction and slaughter on a massive scale. Cities that resisted were sometimes razed entirely, their populations killed as examples to others. The Mongols used terror as a weapon, knowing that word of their ruthlessness would travel ahead of their armies and make other cities more likely to surrender without a fight. It's a difficult paradox to hold in mind. The same leader who implemented merit-based promotion and religious tolerance also presided over campaigns of devastating violence. Genghis Khan was not a gentle reformer or a benevolent philosopher king. He was a conqueror who understood that empires are built on both organization and fear, that power comes from the ability to destroy as well as the wisdom to build. Yet even as his armies conquered, Genghis Khan was creating something that would outlast the immediate violence. He established a network of relay stations across his empire, called yam posts, where riders could change horses and rest. This system allowed messages to travel across thousands of kilometers with remarkable speed. A message could go from one end of the empire to the other in a matter of weeks, an astonishing achievement for the 13th century. These relay stations did more than just carry military dispatches. They made long-distance trade safer and more reliable. Merchants who had once risked robbery and death on the Silk Road now traveled under the protection of Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For all its brutal origins, the empire created conditions where East and West could exchange goods, ideas, and technologies in ways that had never been possible before. Genghis Khan also implemented a code of laws called the Yasa. These laws governed everything from military discipline to social conduct, creating a unified legal system across the diverse territories of the empire. The Yasa was harsh. Punishment for many crimes was death, but it was also consistent and applied equally to all, regardless of background. In a vast empire composed of many different peoples and cultures, this legal framework provided stability and predictability. Perhaps most surprisingly, given the violence of his conquests, Genghis Khan practiced religious tolerance. The Mongols themselves practiced shamanism and animism, but Genghis Khan recognized that his empire contained Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and followers of many other faiths. Rather than trying to impose religious uniformity, he granted tax exemptions to religious institutions and protected clergy of all faiths. This wasn't purely idealistic, it was practical. Religious tolerance reduced resistance and made the empire easier to govern. The paradoxes multiply the more we examine his legacy. A man who rose from nothing to rule everything. A leader who promoted equality of opportunity while conquering vast territories through force. A conqueror whose violence opened trade routes and enabled cultural exchange. A ruler who practiced religious tolerance while his armies destroyed cities and populations. The relay stations, the merit-based promotion system, the legal codes, the protection of trade routes. These were not incidental features of Genghis Khan's empire. They were deliberate choices, structures put in place to hold together territories so vast and diverse that they might otherwise have fractured immediately. He understood that conquest alone was not enough, that building something lasting required organization, communication, and systems that could function across enormous distances and different cultures. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, who would continue to expand it. But the systems he had created remained. The trade routes stayed open. The relay stations continued to function. The precedent of religious tolerance persisted. And the idea of merit-based advancement, of loyalty and competence valued over noble birth, influenced how the empire was governed for generations. The Mongol Empire would eventually fragment, as all empires do. But its effects on world history were profound and lasting. It connected East and West in ways that facilitated the exchange of technologies, crops, and ideas. The plague that devastated Europe in the 14th century likely traveled along Mongol trade routes. So did gunpowder, paper money, and countless other innovations. The world became more connected, for better and worse, because of the empire Genghis Khan built. Looking back across nearly 8 centuries, we see a complex figure, difficult to categorize neatly as either villain or visionary. He was both. The boy abandoned on the steppe grew into a man who could unite fractious tribes through force of will and strategic brilliance. The ruler who promoted equality and tolerance also presided over campaigns of staggering brutality. The conqueror who destroyed cities also built the infrastructure for unprecedented cultural exchange. In the silence of the steppe, where Temujin once struggled to survive, we might imagine him as a young man, looking out across the grasslands, dreaming of something more than just survival. Could he have imagined, in those desperate early years, that he would one day rule from the Pacific to Eastern Europe? That his name would echo through history? That the systems he created would reshape global trade and cultural exchange? The steppe gave him little. From that little he built everything. And in doing so, he changed the world in ways both terrible and transformative, ways we're still trying to fully understand centuries after his death. The harsh land that should have killed him instead forged him into someone who would reshape the map of the world, leaving a legacy that remains contested, complex, and impossible to ignore. In the year 632, in the Korean kingdom of Silla, something unprecedented happened. A woman ascended to the throne as reigning monarch, not as a regent for a young king or as a queen consort, but as the ruler in her own right. Her name was Seondeok, and her reign would test whether a woman could hold power in a world that had always assumed leadership belonged to men. Silla was one of 3 kingdoms that divided the Korean peninsula in this period, along with Goguryeo to the north and Beich to the west. These kingdoms existed in a constant state of tension, sometimes engaging in open warfare, sometimes maintaining uneasy truces, always aware that the balance of power could shift at any moment. Into this precarious geopolitical situation stepped Queen Seondeok, facing not only external threats but also internal opposition from nobles who questioned whether a woman could effectively rule. The opposition was not subtle. Aristocratic factions who had held power under previous kings saw the succession of a queen as an opportunity to increase their own influence, or perhaps as a weakness they could exploit. They doubted openly whether a woman possessed the political acumen, the strength, the authority necessary to defend the kingdom and maintain royal power. Some of this was genuine belief in the limitations of women, shaped by centuries of patriarchal tradition. Some was political calculation, nobles seeing a chance to expand their own power at the expense of what they perceived as a weakened throne. Seondeok would have to prove them wrong, not through proclamations or assertions of authority, but through actual accomplishment. And she understood that this would require more than just military strength or political maneuvering. It would require demonstrating wisdom, foresight, and an understanding of how to use all the tools of statecraft available to her. One of her most famous initiatives was the construction of Gyeongseongdi, a stone observatory that still stands today, often described as one of the oldest surviving astronomical observatories in East Asia. This might seem like an unusual priority for a ruler facing military threats and political opposition, but in the context of 7th century Korea, it made perfect sense. Astronomy was not merely an academic pursuit in this era. It was essential for agriculture, determining when to plant and harvest. It was important for ritual and religion, understanding the movements of the heavens and their relationship to events on earth. And it was a demonstration of royal authority and wisdom, showing that the monarch understood the patterns of the cosmos and could guide the kingdom accordingly. By sponsoring the construction of Gyeongseongdi, Seondeok was making a statement about her reign, that it would be characterized by learning, foresight, and attention to the fundamental rhythms that governed life in her kingdom. But Seondeok's strategy for securing her position went beyond demonstrating wisdom. She also understood the power of religion in 7th century Korea. Buddhism had become increasingly influential on the peninsula, and Seondeok became a major patron of Buddhist temples, art, and relics. This wasn't merely personal piety, though she may well have been genuinely devout. It was statecraft. By aligning herself with Buddhism and sponsoring major religious projects, Seondeok was creating cultural and spiritual legitimacy for her reign. Buddhist institutions had resources, influence, and connections across the region. Buddhist monks and scholars could help shape public opinion, could present the queen as a righteous ruler blessed by the Dharma. The temples and artworks she sponsored became lasting monuments to her reign, physical embodiments of royal power and cultural achievement that would outlast immediate political controversies. Seondeok was creating a cultural identity for Silla that could compete with the other kingdoms. Goguryeo and Beach had their own rich traditions and accomplishments. Silla, under Seondeok's patronage, was establishing itself as a center of Buddhist culture and learning, a kingdom where art and scholarship flourished alongside military strength. Yet the military and political challenges remained constant. To the north, Goguryeo was a formidable power with a long martial tradition. To the west, Beach had its own ambitions and capabilities. Seondeok recognized that Silla could not face these threats alone. She needed allies, and the most powerful potential ally in the region was Tang China, a vast empire that had recently reunified China and was looking to extend its influence. Diplomatic relations with Tang China were delicate. On one hand, Chinese support could provide crucial military assistance against Goguryeo and Beach. On the other hand, becoming too dependent on China risked Silla's independence. The Tang emperors might decide that Korea would be better off as a Chinese province rather than an independent kingdom. Seondeok had to navigate this carefully, cultivating Chinese support while maintaining Silla's autonomy. The alliances she forged and the diplomatic relationships she maintained would have consequences that extended beyond her lifetime. Her successors would eventually use the Tang alliance to unify the Korean peninsula under Silla's rule, though this victory would come with complications and costs. But the groundwork was laid during Seondeok's reign, through careful diplomacy that balanced Silla's immediate needs against its long-term interests. Throughout all of this, the opposition from nobles, the external threats, the careful diplomatic maneuvering, the cultural and religious initiatives, Seondeok was operating under scrutiny that a male ruler would not have faced. Every decision was examined for evidence that a woman couldn't rule effectively. Every setback was attributed to her gender rather than to the difficult circumstances she navigated. Every success had to be overwhelming to overcome the presumption that she would fail. And yet she persisted, ruling for 15 years, from 632 to 647. That may not seem like a long reign by some standards, but in the context of the 7th century, in a kingdom facing constant threats and internal political tensions, 15 years of continuous rule was a significant achievement. And for a woman facing opposition based on her gender, maintaining power for a decade and a half while also advancing the kingdom's interests was remarkable. The observatory she built still stands, stones carefully placed to track the movement of celestial bodies across the seasons. The temples she sponsored became centers of learning and culture. The diplomatic relationships she cultivated set the stage for the eventual unification of Korea. These were not abstract accomplishments. They were concrete achievements that shaped the future of her kingdom and her people. When we think about Queen Seondeok, we should remember that she was pioneering in the most literal sense. She was the first woman to rule Silla, navigating a path through territory that no woman before her in that society had traveled. She couldn't simply follow established precedents for queenly behavior, because there were no precedents for a reigning queen. She had to create the role as she went, demonstrating that a woman could defend the kingdom, conduct diplomacy, patronize culture, and wield political power as effectively as any king. Her success made it possible for other women to rule Silla after her. 2 more queens would ascend to Silla's throne in the decades following her reign, building on the precedent she had established. Without Seondeok's example, without her proving that a woman could rule effectively, these later queens might never have had the opportunity. In the quiet halls of Seongdeok, where stone and sky meet, we might imagine the spirit of what Seondeok tried to build. A kingdom where wisdom mattered as much as strength, where cultural achievement counted as much as military victory, where the movements of the heavens were understood as carefully as the movements of armies. A kingdom where, against all expectations and despite all opposition, a woman could hold the throne and hold it well. The stones of the observatory remain, lasting testimony to a reign that combined science, religion, and diplomacy in service of a fragile kingdom. They remind us that power takes many forms, that strength can be demonstrated through construction as well as conquest, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to succeed when everyone expects you to fail. Queen Seondeok of Silla ruled in challenging times, faced opposition that no male monarch would have encountered, and nevertheless maintained her throne while advancing her kingdom's interests. She built institutions that lasted beyond her lifetime, forged alliances that shaped the future, and proved that leadership had nothing to do with gender and everything to do with wisdom, courage, and the ability to navigate complexity with grace and determination. The stars still wheel overhead, following the patterns that Seongdeok was built to observe. The kingdom she ruled has long since transformed into something new. But the memory remains of a queen who looked at the heavens and understood their movements, who looked at the political landscape and navigated its dangers, who looked at tradition and precedent and chose to create something new, proving that the future need not be limited by the assumptions of the past. In the year 1520, a young man of 25 inherited an empire that already stretched across 3 continents. His name was Suleiman, and he would preside over what many consider the Ottoman Empire's golden age, a period when Ottoman power, culture, and influence reached heights that would never quite be matched again. The Europeans would call him the Magnificent, awed by the splendor of his court and the reach of his power. But within his own empire, he was known by a different title, Kanuni, the Lawgiver, a name that spoke to accomplishments that went far beyond military conquest. The Ottoman Empire that Suleiman inherited was already formidable. His predecessors had transformed what had begun as a small principality in Anatolia into a multi-ethnic empire controlling parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, had fallen to the Ottomans in 1453, becoming Istanbul, a jewel of Islamic civilization. But empires don't maintain themselves. They require constant attention, constant effort, constant adaptation to new challenges and opportunities. Suleiman understood this from the beginning of his reign. He was not content to simply preserve what had been handed to him. He wanted to expand Ottoman power, to push the boundaries further, to make the empire not just large but truly dominant in the regions it touched. And so he led campaigns personally, not directing wars from the comfort of a distant palace, but commanding from the field, traveling with his armies, sharing in the hardships and dangers of military life. His campaigns in Europe were particularly significant. The Kingdom of Hungary became a target, and Ottoman forces pushed deep into Central Europe. In 1526, at the Battle of Mohacs, Suleiman's army achieved a decisive victory that effectively ended Hungarian independence. Much of Hungary came under Ottoman control, while other portions fell to the Habsburgs, creating a complex 3-way division that would shape Central European politics for generations. But Suleiman aimed even higher. In 1529, Ottoman forces laid siege to Vienna itself, the capital of the Habsburg Empire and one of the great cities of Christian Europe. The siege ultimately failed, Vienna's walls held, and the approach of winter forced the Ottoman army to withdraw. But the attempt sent shockwaves through Europe. The Sultan's armies had reached the heart of the continent, and European powers had to confront the reality that the Ottoman Empire was not some distant threat but an immediate military challenge capable of striking at their most important cities. In the east, Suleiman fought against the Safavid Persian Empire, another major Islamic power with which the Ottomans competed for dominance. These campaigns expanded Ottoman control over Iraq and parts of the Caucasus. In the Mediterranean, Ottoman naval forces challenged European powers for control of the sea, capturing key ports and islands, disrupting trade, and establishing Ottoman naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet for all these military achievements, for all the territory conquered and battles won, Suleiman's reign was about more than just expansion. This was the zenith of Ottoman culture, a period when the arts flourished in ways that would define Ottoman civilization for centuries to come. Architecture, in particular, reached extraordinary heights under Suleiman's patronage. The architect Mimar Sinan, who served Suleiman and his successors, created some of the most stunning buildings in Islamic architecture. Mosques with soaring domes and graceful minarets rose across the empire. The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul, commissioned by Suleiman himself, stands as a masterpiece of Ottoman architecture, its dome seeming to float impossibly above the prayer hall, its proportions achieving a harmony that speaks to both engineering genius and aesthetic vision. But Ottoman culture wasn't limited to architecture. Poetry flourished, with Turkish, Persian and Arabic verse produced at court and in literary circles throughout the empire. Suleiman himself wrote poetry under a pen name, demonstrating that even an emperor at the height of his power could appreciate the subtle arts of verse. Textiles became renowned for their quality and beauty, Ottoman carpets and fabrics prized across Europe and Asia. Calligraphy, the art of beautiful writing, reached new levels of refinement, with master calligraphers creating works that were simultaneously religious texts and artistic masterpieces. Istanbul became a cultural showpiece, a city that combined Byzantine heritage with Islamic tradition, a place where East met West in architecture, art, and daily life. The city's skyline transformed during Suleiman's reign, new mosques and public buildings rising to complement the ancient monuments, creating an urban landscape that proclaimed Ottoman power and sophistication. But perhaps Suleiman's most lasting domestic achievement was legal reform. The title, Kanuni, the lawgiver, reflected work that was less dramatic than military conquest but ultimately more significant for the daily lives of his subjects. The Ottoman Empire had always operated under a complex combination of Islamic law, derived from the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet Muhammad, and imperial decrees issued by sultans. Suleiman undertook to systematize and update this legal framework. His reforms reduced arbitrary taxation, one of the most common complaints subjects had against their rulers throughout history. By standardizing tax collection and limiting what officials could demand, Suleiman made life more predictable and less burdensome for ordinary people. He also worked to reduce abuses by officials, creating mechanisms for subjects to seek redress when wronged by those in authority. These reforms didn't eliminate corruption or oppression. No legal system can do that entirely, but they represented a genuine effort to make governance fairer and more just. The legal reforms balanced Islamic law with the practical needs of governing a vast, diverse empire. Islamic jurisprudence provided moral and spiritual foundations, but the reality of administering territories stretching from Algeria to Iraq, from the Balkans to Arabia, required flexibility and practical adaptation. Suleiman's legal codes provided this flexibility while maintaining respect for Islamic principles. The Ottoman Empire under Suleiman was also notable for its approach to religious and ethnic diversity. The empire was multi-ethnic and multi-religious in ways that were unusual for the time. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side in Ottoman cities. Different religious communities were organized into millets, semi-autonomous groups that handled their own internal affairs, maintained their own religious institutions, and followed their own religious laws in matters of personal status like marriage and inheritance. This system wasn't perfect equality by modern standards. Muslims had certain privileges and non-Muslims paid special taxes. But by the standards of 16th century Europe, where religious wars between Catholics and Protestants were tearing communities apart and where Jewish communities faced persecution and expulsion, the Ottoman system offered relative tolerance and stability. Jewish refugees fleeing the Spanish Inquisition found safety in Ottoman lands. Christian communities maintained their churches and traditions. The empire functioned as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society where diverse peoples owed loyalty to the Sultan while maintaining their distinct identities. Suleiman's reign lasted 46 years, from 1520 to 1566, an extraordinarily long time for a ruler who personally led military campaigns well into his later years. He died while on campaign in Hungary, still leading his armies at age 71. There's something revealing about this, that even in old age, even after decades of rule, even with an empire at its height, Suleiman felt it necessary to command in the field rather than delegate to his generals. The empire he left behind was at its peak in terms of territory, power, and cultural achievement. The generations immediately following Suleiman would see the empire maintain much of this strength, but the absolute zenith had been reached. Never again would Ottoman power quite match what it had been during Suleiman's reign. The military expansion would slow and eventually reverse. The cultural flowering would continue but would face new challenges as Europe underwent its own transformations through the Renaissance, Reformation, and scientific revolution. Looking back across the centuries, we can see Suleiman as a ruler who balanced multiple roles with remarkable success. He was a conqueror who expanded his empire's reach. He was a patron who presided over a cultural golden age. He was a lawgiver who reformed legal systems to make them more just and systematic. He was a leader of a multi-ethnic empire who maintained a system where diverse peoples could coexist while maintaining their distinct identities. The mosques and buildings commissioned during his reign still stand, monuments to an era when Ottoman architecture reached its peak. The legal codes he promulgated influenced Ottoman governance for centuries. The cultural achievements of his era, in poetry, textiles, calligraphy, and other arts, defined what Ottoman culture meant at its finest. The military victories and territorial expansion made the Ottoman Empire a power that Europe had to reckon with as an equal or even a superior. In the quiet of a mosque commissioned by Suleiman, where light filters through stained glass and the dome rises overhead in perfect proportion, we might sense something of what his reign represented. A moment when military power, cultural achievement, and administrative competence all came together under a single ruler. A time when an empire seemed to have found the right balance between conquest and governance, between expansion and consolidation, between Islamic tradition and practical adaptation to diverse realities. Suleiman the Magnificent, Kanyuni the Lawgiver, both titles captured something true about his reign. He was magnificent in the scope of his achievements and the splendor of his court. He was a lawgiver who understood that lasting power required more than just military strength, that it required systems of justice and governance that people could trust and accept. Together, these aspects of his rule created something that endured beyond his lifetime, an empire at its zenith, a moment of achievement that subsequent generations would look back upon with a mixture of pride and nostalgia, remembering when Ottoman power stood at its height and the world took notice. In 1729, a girl was born in a small German principality to a minor noble family. Her name was Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, and nothing in her circumstances suggested she would one day become one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Yet through intelligence, ambition, and a willingness to seize opportunities when they presented themselves, this German princess would transform herself into Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, a ruler who would expand Russian territory, correspond with the leading philosophers of her age, and attempt to modernize one of Europe's most traditional autocracies. Sophie's journey to the Russian throne began when she was selected as a bride for the heir to the Russian Empire, the future Peter III. This was a strategic marriage, designed to create alliances between royal houses, with little consideration for the personal compatibility of the young people involved. Sophie arrived in Russia as a teenager, and immediately began the process of transformation that would define her life. First, she converted to Russian Orthodoxy, the official religion of the empire. This wasn't merely a formality. It was a statement of commitment, a signal that she was choosing Russia over her German heritage. Along with conversion came a new name, Catherine. Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst would remain in the past. The future belonged to Catherine. She also learned Russian, working diligently to master a language quite different from German. Many foreign-born royals never bothered to learn the language of their adopted countries, content to speak their native tongue and rely on interpreters. Catherine understood that language was power, that speaking Russian allowed her to communicate directly with nobles, officials, and others at court without intermediaries who might shape or distort her words. Her marriage to Peter was unhappy. By most accounts, Peter was an unstable and immature man, more interested in playing with toy soldiers than in governance or his wife. He admired Prussia and Prussian military culture, sometimes seeming to prefer his wife's native Germany to his own Russian Empire. Catherine, by contrast, threw herself into Russian court life, cultivating relationships with nobles and military officers, reading widely and preparing herself for a role that extended beyond being merely the emperor's wife. When Peter finally became emperor in 1762, his reign was brief and chaotic. He made decisions that alienated the Russian nobility and military, and he treated Catherine with disdain. Within months, Catherine and her allies among the nobility and military moved against him. In a palace coup, Peter was deposed and Catherine was proclaimed empress. Peter died shortly after, in circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious, though Catherine's involvement in his death, if any, has never been definitively proven. What is clear is that Catherine had seized power decisively, showing a willingness to act when the moment came. A foreign-born woman with no blood claim to the Russian throne had nevertheless managed to become empress through her own efforts, supported by Russian nobles and military officers who believed she would serve Russian interests better than her husband had. And for the next 34 years, until her death in 1796, Catherine would rule Russia with an authority and vision that transformed the empire. She expanded Russian territory dramatically, annexing Crimea and much of the Black Sea coast, pushing into Poland as that kingdom was partitioned among Russia, Prussia, and Austria. By the end of her reign, Russia had grown substantially, gaining warm water ports that had long been strategic goals, securing access to the Black Sea that opened possibilities for trade and military projection southward toward the Ottoman Empire. But Catherine's ambitions went beyond mere territorial expansion. She saw herself as an enlightened monarch, a ruler who would bring Western ideas and modern practices to Russia. She corresponded with leading figures of the European Enlightenment, exchanging letters with Voltaire, the French philosopher and writer, and with Denis Diderot, editor of the famous encyclopedia. These weren't just ceremonial exchanges. Catherine engaged seriously with Enlightenment ideas about governance, law, society, and human nature. She invited Diderot to Russia and supported his work. She commissioned an ambitious law code, summoning a legislative commission and issuing her own instruction, that drew heavily on the works of Montesquieu and Cesare Beccaria, Enlightenment thinkers who wrote about separation of powers, rational legal systems, and humane treatment of criminals. Catherine's instruction called for equality before the law, restrictions on torture, and rational principles of justice. It was an impressive document in line with the most progressive thinking of the age, and ultimately it went nowhere. The legislative commission she summoned became mired in disputes and differences, and the comprehensive legal reform Catherine envisioned never materialized. The gap between Enlightenment rhetoric and Russian reality proved too wide to bridge through proclamations and commissions. This gap was most glaring when it came to serfdom. The vast majority of Russian peasants were serfs, people bound to the land they worked and to the nobles who owned that land. Serfs could be bought and sold, though typically with the land rather than separately. They had few rights and little freedom, living in conditions that differed from slavery more in legal terminology than in practical reality. Catherine, despite her Enlightenment correspondence and her professed belief in rational governance and human dignity, not only maintained serfdom but strengthened it. She expanded noble privileges and tightened the bonds that held serfs to their land and masters. The contradiction was stark. An empress who corresponded with philosophers about human rights while tightening the chains of millions of her own subjects. This wasn't hypocrisy exactly, or at least not simple hypocrisy. Catherine genuinely admired Enlightenment ideas and saw herself as bringing modern, rational governance to Russia. But she also understood that her power depended on the support of the Russian nobility, and the nobility's wealth and power rested on their control of serfs. Challenging serfdom meant challenging the foundation of noble privilege, and Catherine was not willing to risk her throne for the sake of peasants she viewed as backward and potentially dangerous. The danger from peasants was not merely theoretical. In 1773, a massive uprising known as Pugachev's Rebellion swept across Russia. Led by a Cossack named Emelian Pugachev, who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, The rebellion mobilized thousands of serfs, Cossacks, and other discontented groups. They attacked noble estates, killed landlords, and threatened the stability of the entire empire before being brutally suppressed. The rebellion shook Catherine deeply. It confirmed her fears about the dangers of disorder and popular unrest. After Pugachev's defeat and execution, Catherine became more conservative, more concerned with security and stability, less interested in reforms that might disturb the social order. The gap between her Enlightenment rhetoric and her actual policies grew wider. Yet even acknowledging these contradictions and failures, Catherine's reign transformed Russia. She promoted education, founding schools and supporting cultural institutions. She collected art and built up what would become the Hermitage Museum, one of the world's great repositories of European art. She patronized artists, writers, and scholars, creating an atmosphere where Russian culture could develop and engage with broader European currents. She also modernized Russian administration, reorganizing provincial government, improving efficiency, and attempting to reduce corruption. Russia remained an autocracy, but it became a somewhat more organized and functional autocracy, with better systems for managing its vast territories. Catherine's foreign policy made Russia a major European power. She played the diplomatic game skillfully, forming alliances, exploiting the weaknesses of neighbors like Poland and the Ottoman Empire, and ensuring that Russia had a seat at the table when European powers made decisions about the continent's future. Under Catherine, Russia could no longer be dismissed or ignored. It had become one of the great powers, and European diplomacy had to account for Russian interests and Russian ambitions. When Catherine died in 1796, she left an empire that was larger, more powerful, and more culturally developed than the one she had inherited. She had taken a country still seen by many Western Europeans as backward and semi-barbarous and had made it a player in European politics and culture. She had corresponded with philosophers, collected art, promoted education, and presented herself as an enlightened ruler bringing modern ideas to an ancient land. But she had also strengthened serfdom, suppressed rebellions with brutal efficiency, and maintained an absolute autocracy that tolerated no meaningful dissent. The Enlightenment she claimed to embrace remained largely at the level of court conversation and intellectual fashion, never fundamentally challenging the structures of power and exploitation that defined Russian society. Perhaps what Catherine really represented was the limits of enlightened absolutism, the contradiction inherent in trying to reconcile absolute power with Enlightenment ideals of reason, liberty, and human dignity. She wanted to be both an absolute autocrat and an enlightened philosopher queen, and these roles were ultimately incompatible. She could read Voltaire and collect paintings, but she couldn't free the serfs or limit her own power without undermining the very system that made her reign possible. In the grand halls of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, surrounded by the art she had collected and the splendor she had created, Catherine might have believed she had achieved something remarkable. And in many ways she had. She had taken a small German principality's princess and transformed her into an empress who expanded Russia's borders, strengthened its position in Europe, and promoted culture and learning within her domains. But outside the palace, in the villages where serfs worked noble lands with little hope of freedom, in the memories of those who had risen in rebellion and been crushed, a different story was being told. A story of Enlightenment rhetoric that masked the reality of continued oppression, of modernization that served the powerful while leaving the powerless unchanged, of an empress who spoke the language of philosophy while ruling with the iron fist of absolute power. Catherine the Great was both. The enlightened correspondent of philosophers and the absolute autocrat who strengthened serfdom. The patron of arts and education and the suppressor of rebellion. The foreign-born princess who reinvented herself as a Russian empress and the ruler who never fully resolved the contradictions between the ideas she professed and the system she defended. Her legacy, like her reign, remains complex and contested, remarkable in its achievements and troubling in its compromises, a reminder that power and principle are often uneasy companions. In the early 14th century, in the heart of West Africa, an empire controlled wealth that would be legendary even centuries later. The Mali Empire stretched across the Sahel, the region just south of the Sahara Desert, and it controlled something that made it one of the richest states on earth: gold. Vast gold fields lay within Mali's territory, and the empire served as the primary supplier of gold to North Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. And ruling over this empire was Mansa Musa, a king whose wealth would become so famous that his name would echo through the centuries as a symbol of almost unimaginable riches. Mansa Musa came to power around 1312, though the exact date is uncertain. What we know is that he inherited an already prosperous empire, one that his predecessors had built through conquest and careful control of trade routes. But Mansa Musa would expand both the empire's territory and its reputation, taking Mali from a powerful regional kingdom to an empire known across the Islamic world and beyond. The Mali Empire's wealth came not just from gold, but from its position controlling trade routes across the Sahara. Salt from the desert was as valuable as gold in many ways, essential for preserving food and maintaining health in tropical climates where meat and other perishables spoiled quickly. Caravans traveled for weeks across the desert, bringing salt south and carrying gold, ivory, and enslaved people north to markets in North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Mali controlled key points along these routes, collecting taxes and duties, growing wealthy from the commerce that passed through its territory. But it was gold that made Mali legendary. The empire controlled some of the richest gold fields in the world, and this gold found its way into the treasuries of rulers across North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Medieval European gold coins were often minted with gold that had originated in West Africa and traveled through Mali's markets. The wealth was real, substantial, and it made Mansa Musa one of the richest individuals in human history. In 1324, Mansa Musa undertook the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Every Muslim who is able is expected to make this journey at least once in their lifetime. For Mansa Musa, this religious obligation became an opportunity to demonstrate his wealth and piety on a scale that would be remembered for centuries. The caravan that set out from Mali was extraordinary. Contemporary writers reported that it included thousands of attendants, soldiers, and officials. There were camels beyond counting, carrying supplies, gifts, and most importantly, gold. Lots of gold. Mansa Musa reportedly brought so much gold with him that when he distributed it along his route, as gifts, as charity, as payment for supplies, he disrupted local economies. In Cairo, where the caravan stopped for several months, Mansa Musa gave away and spent so much gold that the value of gold in Egypt's markets fell dramatically. Contemporary chroniclers reported that gold remained devalued for years afterward, so much had flooded into the market. This wasn't just legend or exaggeration. The economic impact was real and lasting. A single individual's generosity had been so excessive that it had affected regional prices of precious metals. The generosity wasn't random or thoughtless. It was deliberate, a statement of wealth and power, a demonstration that the Mali Empire was as rich as any kingdom in the Islamic world. Mansa Musa was introducing himself and his empire to the broader Muslim community, showing that West Africa was not a remote backwater but a center of wealth and Islamic civilization. The Hajj also had profound effects on how Mali was perceived in North Africa and the Middle East. Before Mansa Musa's journey, many people in these regions had only vague ideas about West African kingdoms. After his pilgrimage, Mali was known, talked about, and recorded in chronicles and maps. Famous medieval maps began depicting a crowned African king holding a gold nugget, representing Mansa Musa and his empire. He had literally put Mali on the map. But Mansa Musa's legacy extended beyond just demonstrating wealth. He used his riches to build and support Islamic institutions throughout his empire. In cities like Timbuktu and Gao, along the Niger River, he sponsored the construction of mosques and madrasas, Islamic schools where students could study the Quran, Islamic law, theology, mathematics, astronomy, and other subjects. Timbuktu, in particular, flourished as a center of Islamic learning under Mansa Musa's patronage. Scholars came from across the Islamic world to study and teach in Timbuktu's institutions. Libraries were established, manuscripts were copied and collected, and the city became known as a place where knowledge was valued and pursued. The intellectual tradition that Mansa Musa helped establish in Timbuktu would continue for centuries, making it one of the most important centers of Islamic scholarship in Africa. This intellectual and religious investment was as important as any military conquest or economic policy. Mansa Musa was building cultural capital, creating institutions that would outlast him and would continue to serve his people long after his death. The mosques and schools he built were not just buildings. They were investments in the spiritual and intellectual life of his empire, creating centers where Islamic knowledge could be preserved, transmitted, and expanded. The Sankor Mosque in Timbuktu, associated with one of the city's most important centers of learning, became a symbol of Mali's cultural achievement. Students studied there who would go on to become scholars, judges, and teachers throughout West Africa and beyond. The manuscripts preserved in Timbuktu's libraries contain not just religious texts but also works on science, medicine, history, and literature, representing centuries of intellectual tradition. Mansa Musa's sponsorship of Islamic education also served a practical purpose. It helped integrate his diverse empire under a common religious and cultural framework. The Mali Empire included many different ethnic groups, speaking different languages and maintaining different local traditions. Islam provided a unifying force, a shared religious identity that could help hold this diverse empire together. By promoting Islamic learning and building religious institutions, Mansa Musa was strengthening the bonds that connected his empire's various peoples. When Mansa Musa died around 1337, after a reign of roughly 25 years, he left behind an empire at its height. Mali controlled vast territories from the Atlantic coast in the west to the salt mines of the Sahara in the north, encompassing the wealthy cities of the Niger Bend like Timbuktu and Gao. Trade flourished, gold continued to flow from Mali's mines to markets across the known world, and the empire's cultural and intellectual institutions made it a center of Islamic civilization in West Africa. But perhaps more importantly, Mansa Musa had changed how the rest of the world viewed West Africa. Before his reign, many people in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe had little knowledge of the kingdoms south of the Sahara. After his famous pilgrimage, after the stories spread of his incredible wealth and generosity, Mali became known throughout the Islamic world and beyond. West Africa was no longer a mysterious, distant region but a place of real kingdoms, real wealth, and real cultural achievement. The institutions he built, the mosques, the schools, the libraries, continued to function long after his death, preserving and transmitting knowledge through generations. The intellectual traditions he supported made Timbuktu and other cities centers of learning that would be remembered for centuries. And the story of his wealth, his generosity, and his pilgrimage became legendary, told and retold until Mansa Musa became perhaps the most famous African ruler in history. In the quiet halls of a library in Timbuktu, where ancient manuscripts are still preserved, we might sense something of what Mansa Musa built. Not just mosques and schools, not just buildings of mud, brick, and wood, but institutions that carried knowledge across generations, that preserved the intellectual heritage of Islamic civilization in Africa, that made learning possible for countless students who would never have had access to education otherwise. His gold is long gone, spent and dispersed, flowing through the economies of medieval Africa and beyond until it became untraceable. But the institutions remain, at least in memory and in the traditions they established. The mosques still stand, rebuilt and restored over centuries but still serving their communities. The intellectual tradition of Timbuktu, though much diminished from its medieval height, has never completely disappeared. Mansa Musa showed that wealth could be more than just accumulation, that riches could be used to build something lasting. The gold from Mali's mines could have simply filled royal treasuries, could have been hoarded or spent on luxury and display. Instead, at least some of it went to building mosques where people could pray, schools where they could learn, libraries where knowledge could be preserved. This doesn't mean Mansa Musa was perfect or that his empire was without flaws. Mali, like other medieval empires, was built partly through conquest and maintained partly through force. The trans-Saharan trade that enriched Mali included the trade in enslaved people, a grim reality of the medieval economy. But within the context of his time and place, Mansa Musa's use of wealth to promote learning and religion represented a vision of leadership that recognized obligations beyond just power and profit. The legendary pilgrimage, with its thousands of attendants and its mountains of gold, demonstrated that Mali was a great power. But the schools and mosques, the promotion of learning and religion, the creation of institutions that would serve generations, these demonstrated something more enduring. They showed that a ruler's legacy could be measured not just in territory controlled or wealth accumulated, but in knowledge preserved, in opportunities created for learning and spiritual growth, in the institutions that continue to serve people long after the builder has passed into history. And so we remember Mansa Musa not just as the king with legendary wealth, not just as the man who disrupted Cairo's gold market with his generosity, but as the ruler who built schools in the Sahara, who made Timbuktu a center of Islamic learning, who used the gold of West Africa to create something more lasting than any treasure hoard. A legacy written not in gold but in knowledge, not in conquest but in culture, not in monuments to power but in institutions of learning that would outlast any empire.